Alright guys, hope you guys are doing well. We're on the home stretch for this unit with Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, and today we're going to be focusing on Monroe and the era of good feelings. You should have some notes, they're fill in the blanks, so feel free to grab those and fill them in as we go along, and feel free to stop the video if you need to. But without further ado, let's get going. Building a national identity. So the War of 1812 resulted with Democratic Republicans being incredibly popular. Now you might think, why are they popular considering the war was kind of a tie and nothing really happened? It was all because of that battle of New Orleans. People were remembering that they literally creamed the British in the last battle and it wasn't even close. So during the 1816 election, the Democratic Republican candidate James Monroe wins in a landslide. And that would be the end of the Federalist Party. After losing 3 straight presidencies, you might want to rethink your strategy and there'll be no more. Now, James Monroe, he had a big belief in promoting national unity, and a local newspaper called this time period of James Monroe the era of good feelings. And these good feelings are going to roll all the way to James Monroe being reelected in 1820. Now, if I were your guys' age, I would think of something along the lines of, what's so good about the era of good feelings, Mr. Shoens? Like, I don't know, dude. Well, there's a lot of things going well for America during this time period. If you remember the video that you guys watched with Crash Course, there was the market revolution. So now there are suddenly new ways to bring stuff to market. The factories are starting to be made. People are making a lot more money. Goods are being available that have never been available to people before because it's really difficult to transport stuff across land by horse that you can now transport by boat thanks to Robert Fulton. So the economy is going to be doing well, and the United States is going to be expanding its territory without warfare. During Monroe's presidency, the U.S. is going to not only gain Florida as a territory, but 5 states are going to enter the Union. Wait a minute, Mr. Shoens. Florida? Like, the state we live in? Yeah. At the time of the War of 1812, Spain controlled more territory than the United States in North America than the United States or any European country. Now, if you don't believe me, it's simple to look at the map. They still have control of everything in red right there. All of that where Mexico is, Central America, most of the Caribbean, a lot of Western United States today, still technically all had a Spanish flag on it. However, the power of Spain's control over this area had been severely weakened ever since the Spanish Armada had sunk, all the way back in 1588. If you don't have a huge navy to go to those places to make sure that they're still under your control, do you really have control of those areas? So without that navy, it was a slow decline for Spain to the point that they were basically non-existent in their territories. And this was especially true in Florida. So the year is 1818. The United States is having some troubles with some Native Americans, mostly the Seminole tribe. They would pretty much go into the United States, attack United States troops, and then basically retreat back into Florida because it belonged to Spain, knowing the United States wouldn't set foot in Florida because that would be an act of war against Spain. So if I kind of was like looking at the map here, imagine Native Americans on the northern parts of Florida going into U.S. territory and basically attacking U.S. cities and U.S. troops and basically running away into Florida, deep inside Florida territory. So that way they would not be vulnerable to any United States retaliation. Because if the U.S. goes from, like, let's say Georgia all the way down into Florida with troops, suddenly the U.S. is now at war with Spain. So it was a tricky situation for all parties involved. Now, fortunately for us, Monroe works out a deal with the Spanish. He basically talks to the Spanish government, was like, look, I got this problem with Native Americans who are literally up to no good in my territory. You mind if I send a small force to go into there, deal with the people in that situation, the criminals, and bring them to justice? I'm not going to invade you. I'm not going to conquer any of your land. Don't look at troops with U.S. flags going by as an act of an invasion. You have my word. And Spain agreed. So Monroe sends out Andrew Jackson, who, if you remember from the Battle of New Orleans, who will eventually be seventh President of the United States, to go and deal with the Seminoles in Florida and bring them to justice. Monroe made it very clear to Jackson, though, do not engage with the Spanish. We are guests in that territory. They are letting us go and deal with our business. Don't ruin it. However, during his time in Florida, he'll capture escaped slaves that escaped down to Florida seeking for refuge, and he'll also destroy Seminole villages as well as get the people who were responsible for many attacks on the U.S. But he kind of was taking notice as he was going through all these Spanish territories. He noticed the forts specifically, and all the major forts in the Spanish towns were barely being guarded. In one report Andrew Jackson had, he claims that a Spanish fort in Florida had 2 soldiers guarding the entire fort. That's not a lot of people, especially when Andrew Jackson is a great general. I mean, just think of the Battle of New Orleans. You're down 3-1 and you literally smoke the competition. So Andrew Jackson, being himself, was like, I know I've been told not to conquer this, but I'm going to conquer it. And he seizes Spanish towns, captures their forts, and conquers the territory of Florida. The Spanish governor who was in charge of the territory literally had to flee for his life and go back to Spain. And Spain was like, hey, why are you back here? Shouldn't you be in Florida? He's like, nope, Florida's been conquered. Now, in any other circumstances, this would be an act of war. We sent troops into an area, they attacked, they conquered. However, Spain was in no position to fight the United States. In fact, Spain was like, what if we fight them and they take the rest of our territory in North America? So working out a deal was a much better option for the Spanish. As a result, Spain gives Florida to the United States of America through the Adams-Onis Treaty. John Quincy Adams was the guy who went there to negotiate the treaty. Now, this is a huge political victory for Andrew Jackson, and people are going to remember this when Andrew Jackson runs for president. There are your notes on James Monroe and Spain losing Florida. So Florida is ours. If you've ever wondered why it's called Jacksonville, now you know. But that's not the only territory Spain is going to lose during this time period. And this isn't going to necessarily be directly because of the United States. It more was a movement going on in Spanish America. Both the American and French revolutions had caused these Spanish colonies, who have been Spanish colonies all the way since Christopher Columbus, to question why they are Spanish. And when Spain was too weak to deal with them, these countries could fight their own revolutions and gain their own independence. In fact, to put in perspective just how, not pathetic, but how weak Spain was at this time, they basically gave independence to a lot of these places. They were like, hey, Mexico, you want to be independent? Go for it. And by 1825, most of Latin America had thrown off whatever European power, mostly Spain, was in control of them. Now, that was an interesting opportunity for some other countries. So Spain's out, but the British have a good navy. The French have a decent navy. And the Russians, which we haven't really talked about, but they are a thing, the Tsar's like, why not go conquer those territories that just declared independence and just recolonize them in your own image? These guys have wanted those territories all the way back from Christopher Columbus time. I mean, to kind of put it in perspective, imagine if you had a friend who had a house, and you really want that house, but as long as they live in that house, obviously you can't have that house. And let's say you've wanted that house for 300 plus years, and then suddenly they're evicted, meaning they're no longer in that house. And there's nothing standing between you and what you want. That's the position the British, the French, and the Russians are in. But the United States says, not so fast. These countries are off limits. Monroe is going to sign something legendary known as the Monroe Doctrine, which basically stated that if any European power went into the Western Hemisphere and tried to recolonize these newly independent countries, you're dealing with the United States of America. And this is the reason a lot of the countries in Central America, the Caribbean, and South America kept their independence. Because a lot of those countries, Russia, the British, or the French, would have went in and conquered those areas for the gold, the spices, the trade stuff, slavery, whatever it may have been. But the United States flat out said, "You be fighting us at that point, and the European powers will back off." To be fair, they just went to a different continent to colonize instead. You'll learn more about that when you learn about colonization of Africa. There are your notes on the Monroe Doctrine. The age of Jackson. So Monroe is going to resign after his second term, following Washington's example. And then the election of 1824 is going to be a heated competition for the White House. And this is going to be the first time Andrew Jackson runs for President of the United States. And his main political rival will be John Quincy Adams, the son of the second president, John Adams. Now, Andrew Jackson's got a lot going for him. Battle of New Orleans hero, acquiring Florida for the nation. These are very convincing things in order to make Andrew Jackson the sixth president of the United States. However, in history, some things are just not so simple. The chaos of the election. 4 people will run for president of the United States. No candidate is going to get a majority of electoral votes. And whenever that happens, the House of Representatives will vote on who becomes president of the United States. So, in theory, it shouldn't be a problem, because if the House of Representatives goes based upon what their population wants, then the person who gets the most votes is going to win, unless there's corruption, and something known as the corrupt bargain happens. Long story short, the Speaker of the House at the time, Henry Clay, made a deal with John Quincy Adams, one of the candidates in the election. Henry Clay basically told him, "Look, if you ensure that I'll have a good position in your White House, like I'm part of your cabinet or something like that, I'll make sure you win this election." And that was all he needed. Now, if you don't realize how significant this is, do you remember in civics last year how much power the Speaker of the House has? They're the leader of the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives was picking the president. So even though Andrew Jackson got the most votes, electoral votes, as well as popular vote, John Quincy Adams is going to win president of the United States because the House of Representatives votes for Quincy Adams, because Henry Clay used his influence there. But Andrew Jackson will be back. He will run for the next election, and John Quincy Adams will be history. Quincy Adams really won't accomplish a whole lot as president, thus he'll be a one-term president like his father. And those are your notes on the corrupt bargain, and that's the end for this unit's notes. Be on the lookout for Thursday and Friday for an assessment that you have to do. Our next unit's going to be talking about Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian America. Anywho, make sure you have all of your notes, keep up with your assignments, and be ready for the assessment Thursday and Friday.